We have a session here of a number of distinguished geographers who have all been or presently are presidents, vice presidents, past presidents of the American Association of Geographers. And we put this together following the conclusion of the election, when we got a lot of, we had a lot of contact by email, by phone, and personal conversations by our members who were really concerned about lots of different things, and the divisiveness of that the election created, and what the AAG was going to do, how we were going to respond, and how we might serve to protect geography during these times. I also do want to tell you that we got things from both sides of the political spectrum. We had some members who feel that they do not want us to be inflammatory, that the election was the will of the people. And we have others, of course, who feel that there are certain human rights or environment that potentially would be trampled based on some of the pre-election rhetoric. So we thought it would be good to have a session which did two things, which is brought the perspectives from the AAG leadership, past, present, and future, here to bear, and what our perspectives are and where the nation is today. And of course, things have changed as we've moved into the first 100 days of the new administration. And also to have a dialogue with you where you could provide questions to us. A number of us are on the council right now and are dealing with the AAG's navigation through these times. And also then we could inform you about what we're doing and what we plan to do in the future. So we really do want this to be a conversation. And so we will have brief perspectives, which will talk about our perspectives in terms of our scholarly activities, our activities as public intellectuals, and our perspectives in terms of what this means for the AAG. And then we will have a dialogue. So we are going to go down the line here. We have Sarah Bednarz, who is currently the past president of the AAG, Alex Murphy, who was formerly a president of the AAG, Julie Winkler, who was a president of the AAG, Victoria Lawson, a president of the AAG, Derek Alderman, who is the current vice president, and as of July 1st will be the president of this association, and then Doug Richardson, our very capable executive director. So, you know, if you're complaining about the people, the system, this is the system, past, present, and future here. It gives you a chance to really engage with it. But there are also people who've worked hard and are working hard for this association and for many values that we cherish. So we're going to go down the line and we're going to hear from everybody with a short presentation, their views, and then we're going to have a conversation with all of us here. So I'd like to start then with Sarah Bednarz.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to start, I'm going to focus on higher education issues, and I just want to get you to remember that President Trump is the man who said, "I love the poorly educated." So it just captures what his attitude is toward education. He has certainly capitalized on the post-factual turn, and this reflects actually, very sadly, an overall indifference to higher education, in fact, to education in general. And this is really engendering something that we all have experienced, this kind of populist resentment of education. And worse, his whole administration has created this climate affecting openness to ideas and debate on college campuses. So what I'm going to do is try to organize what I perceive as his most egregious impacts. It's kind of a litany of sorrows, and I want to talk about student issues, institutional issues, and then mention one faculty issue. Well, in terms of student issues, probably one of the biggest impacts he's having now is on people who are deferred action childhood arrival students, so DACA. So these are the people that no longer know whether it's safe for them to be on campus, whether they can continue their educations. They don't know what their status is in any way, shape, or form. It's just having a huge chilling effect. The whole issue around sanctuary campuses. You know, what is a sanctuary campus? What kinds of protections are campuses going to give to the students who are there? And it kind of, if you delve down a little bit more into the whole policy issue, he has begun to work in ways that erodes what we perceive as student protections, particularly in regards to predatory student loan programs. And finally, there's just a whole raft of kind of safety issues because of attacks on Title IX across campuses. The fact that the Justice Department and the Department of Education have all indicated kind of a retraction of commitment to Title IX and the protections that gives us, particularly to women and related to sexual harassment. Well, in terms of institutional issues, one thing that we've talked about, Sue Roberts brought it up at council a couple days ago, there's certainly been a chill in student enrollment from foreign countries. I think the figure I've seen in Chronicle of Higher Education is about 40% of U.S. colleges are seeing declines in applications from international students. And this is both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And this is driven by perceptions, first of all, of a rise in student visa denials. Second, by perceptions that the climate is less welcoming in the United States. Canada is looking better and better. And concerns that benefits and restrictions around visas could change students' freedom to travel. So the idea of they might be able to get to the United States, but they would not be able to go home for vacations or if there was a family emergency or anything like that. It's interesting for me to look at Betsy DeVos in the Department of Education and see her clear message is support for community colleges, trade, and vocational education, to the kind of detriment of the kind of classic higher education that most of us are engaged in. They both, DeVos and Trump, believe that four-year colleges are not serving students well, and they plan to trim the federal education budget because of that. The thing that I've heard people talking about most here, however, has been Trump's proposal or the budget's proposal to cut indirect costs. No more overhead. This is going to have a significant effect on how institutions operate. I mean, those of us who are in or were in R1 institutions, I mean, the whole system is going to break apart if people don't have access to IDC. And then finally, if you look at our latest appointment to the Supreme Court, there are a number of questions about decisions that have been made in the past, particularly Fisher versus Texas, in terms of whether that we're going to be able to recruit through diversity, for diversity. So affirmative action is certainly going to be impacted by a new, probably more conservative Supreme Court. And there's already some kind of step back from race-conscious admissions policies and open admissions policies. And then the last thing I'll mention is a faculty issue primarily. It's the whole idea of free travel and access to colleagues and this extreme vetting, whatever the hell that is. So.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll stand just because I'm kind of a restless guy, and I know some of my other panelists are going to stand, but don't let that take away from the informality of the occasion generally. So I'm again Alec Murphy at the University of Oregon, and my charge in 10 minutes or less is just to say a few things about political implications, national and international. So a nice narrow topic that can easily be dealt with in a given time. I could stand up here and give a personal screed about my own thoughts. I want to try not to do that strictly. Undoubtedly, some of my own views of this situation will enter in, but I want to try to sketch what I see are a few sort of major aspects of the international and domestic scenes, and then talk about some lessons from that, lessons for scholarship and lessons for the geography community in general, because that's the general idea, is to try to connect what's going on with our own disciplinary practices. So briefly, internationally, I think, even leaving aside whatever personal screed I might want to offer, that it's not an exaggeration to say that we have in the White House someone of unprecedented lack of experience in the international political arena, and I think actually even some supporters would actually agree with that and in some ways celebrate it. And at least an apparent lack of deep grasp of political history and political geography. And what we have not yet seen, at least, is much of a sense of an overarching vision for international affairs, but rather a sort of discrete set of initiatives that keep going sort of one way and then another. We've also seen, just objectively, an extraordinary exodus of key members of the foreign policy establishment, below the level of political appointees. And many of these people, of course, had deep institutional knowledge and experience. In addition, we've seen a significant breakdown, or at least alienation, between the foreign policy establishment and the White House. And we've seen some fairly active, I think by any definition, misrepresentations of circumstances that bear on international relations. And I'm not just talking about, the comment during the campaign about the country of Brussels or the other kinds of things that make geographers laugh, but thinking more about, statements that are made about Germany's fiscal obligations vis-a-vis NATO, the nature of the relationship between the United States and Mexico, the geographic character of international migration to the United States, the status of the Chinese government's approach to monetary policy, and on and on. And of course, the consequence of these things is, I think, unquestionably a stretched, if not torn, fabric of international relations that is got a lot of people concerned. Things may, of course, rock along, but as we know from even this week, crises will develop. And it's really entirely unclear at this point how some of those are going to go. The kinds of checks and balances that have worked so far to frustrate, at least to slow down the administration's travel ban, don't necessarily exist in the international arena, and this makes a lot of people, at the very least, nervous. There is great uncertainty, I think, at the very least one can say, about the international arena, both in terms of those involved with policymaking in Washington, D.C., and those in other capitals around the world. For those who are concerned about the current turn of affairs and the kinds of policy positions that are represented, at least to a degree, by the current administration, I suppose there's a possible small silver lining in that there's been a pretty negative reaction around the world to the current U.S. administration, including among those who might be more sympathetic to anti-establishment movements in other parts of the world. So will this, it's an open question, be enough to derail a bit the move towards greater support for Marine Le Pen in France? Did it have some impact on the Wilders election recently in the Netherlands? So, turning to the domestic, since I do just have a few minutes, most obvious point, and there's an enormous amount one could say, is the most obvious point, I suppose, when you think about ramifications of what's happening, is the further entrenchment of the political polarization that has so undermined our polity. And, of course, things like the choice of how to deliver the inauguration speech a few weeks ago very much played into the political polarization that exists. Much of what's being said challenges the sense of legitimacy of institutions that are essential to the country and its governing structure, the courts, the media, academia, of course, nonpartisan institutions such as the OMB. And the backdrop, of course, to all this is an entrenched sense of animosity on the part of different communities that are part of our contemporary polity. Now, we've seen an upsurge to some degree in civic engagement on the part of citizens at large, but many challenges lie ahead that are rooted in these extraordinary divisions that have developed in our country. So I want to turn in my last few minutes to, first of all, what I see as some general lessons for those, some conceptual and applied lessons for those of us who, many of us operate in university settings and so forth, and then some very specific things that apply to how we do geography. So the general lessons, I see at least 4 of them. One of them, when one looks at what's happened recently, is I think what we've seen reflects both the insights of postmodernism, that is, the power of discourse, spin, surface appearances to drive outcomes, not just tangible circumstances, but also perhaps some of the limits of that way of viewing the world. That facts should matter at some level, even though all facts may be interested, not all facts are necessarily alternative facts. Not all truths are created equal. Second, that emotions and feelings matter in human affairs. The Enlightenment-rooted idea of homo economicus is really not adequate. I think it's becoming increasingly clear to the task of explaining what's going on. Many reasonably well-off people voted for Trump, nor is reducing it all down to racism going to explain everything. The fundamental premise of our existing intellectual frameworks is the assumptions that humans are essentially rational and motivated by the pursuit of their own interests, and those own interests are seen in largely simple neoclassical economic terms. But that ignores the role that fear, anxiety, resentments, and feelings of marginalization play in human affairs. And I could go on and on at some length about this, but I think to ignore those dimensions of what is going on is simply to engage in a process that furthers the polarization that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Third, a follow-on from my second point is that there is a price to pay, I think it's fairly clear, when one looks across the last couple of decades, to ignoring segments of the population and places that are suffering. Both parties have exhibited what has been called a studied indifference to the emotional dislocation and economic suffering induced by modern capitalism and globalization. Where is the war on poverty today? You know, you listen to Lyndon Johnson's speeches and you sort of think, well, that's outside the political mainstream in many senses today. Where is the modern equivalent of a Tennessee Valley Authority? Who, outside of the local sphere, is asking, what do we want this or that place to be like? And finally, it seems to me this greater lesson of all this is that actually knowing something about history and geography matter. You know, if you think about the nature and quality of the public debate that raged over the course of the campaign and into this year, it was dominated by very simple ideas, as if these simple ideas are actually explanations for complex problems. You know, if there's a concern about job loss, build a wall. If there's a concern about trade balances, you know, scrap trade deals. If there's a concern about crime, deport undocumented people en masse. If there's a concern about, well, I could go on and on. Swallowing any one of these things requires ignoring actually underlying circumstances and complexities. I mean, how can you talk about job loss without saying something about mechanization or differential wage rates or any of the kinds of things that would actually lead to a serious discussion of this kind of issue? Or how can one talk about some of the dynamics that are going on between the US and Mexico without understanding the fundamental interpenetration of those economies? Unless those kinds of geographical circumstances are understood, little will change. So what are the implications for geographers, the community of geographers, for our role and what we do? I would suggest there are 4 of them, and they're related to each of those 4 points, and this will just take me a minute, so I'm getting the stop sign. First of all, theoretically, I've already made the point. Recognizing the power and insights of postmodernism, but also recognizing the limits of that approach. For our research, not assuming that rational neoclassical economic expectations and hard data will provide all of the answers. It doesn't mean we can't learn things from them, but to think that we can provide all of the answers is to look aside from some of the fundamental dynamics that seem to be driving the divide today. Third, activism. Don't just criticize, promote thinking about the importance of bottom-up policies that take into account the socioeconomic circumstances of individual places and local senses of places. And then finally, in our teaching and outreach, help those whom we can reach through our teaching and our public outreach to think critically, but also give them sufficient grounding in geographical and historical, dare I say, realities, to challenge the kinds of superficialities that so often seem to win the day. Returning to the international realm, anyone who is cheering the current turn toward a my country first nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic should at least know something about the historical and geographical circumstances that led up to World War I. At least to be aware of the downsides, if not to call the fundamental project into question. These are challenging times indeed, and they call for the best in all of us. May we join together in a constructive effort to make some of what is going on more transparent and help pave the way for a better world. Thank you.
Well, I apologize for using PowerPoint. It's obviously my security blanket on here. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the politicalization of science. I'm a climate scientist, and of course we are the poster child for politicized science. And the presentation I'm doing is a rework of something I was invited to do in December to a working group of the NOAA Science Advisory Board. I point that out because a little bit later here I'm going to show a slide that I label optimism, and it shows how things have changed since December until now in the rapid pace of change. So, okay. So there's, of course, many different definitions of the politicization of science, and the one I'm going to use here is the exploitation then of the inevitable uncertainties about aspects of science to cast doubt on the overall science. Thank you. Okay, so it differs from other sorts of communication strategies such as misinformation, which is the false or misleading or unsubstantiated information, and then framing, of course, emphasizes distinct values. So it's a different type of communication, and it does not attempt to achieve scientific accuracy, and it has really substantial impacts because it causes citizens to dismiss credible scientific information that could be of value to them, and it undermines the positive role that science can play in discourse. On here. On that. And to quote then Tom Dietz, a sociologist, politicalization does not bode well for public decision making on issues with substantial scientific content. We have not been very successful in our efforts to counter ideology frames applied to science. So the question is then, what can we do on that? And so a few things that really kind of are a reminder to me on what I should be doing beyond what I have been doing as a scientist. And of course then is to become involved, to identify and communicate then areas of scientific consensus, and also recognize then the value diversity and avoid imputing value in the presentation of science. And again, quoting Tom Dietz, we make a serious mistake if we assume such fact-based science process resolve conflicts that are based on value differences on that. So focus on the science, minimize the commentary. We also need to avoid the reality that all science involves uncertainty. But at the same time, we have to be careful of the slippery slope of uncertainty so not to facilitate politicalization. So really a very challenging conundrum for us in science. And then frame communication in terms of how policy will affect an individual's life on that, and emphasize really the systematic aspects of science. As Russ Holtz said the other day, emphasize the evidence and clearly distinguish areas of consensus for where consensus is missing. So then going on here to a couple other things that we could possibly do here is to try to minimize motivational reasoning and make it clear that the issue of the information is directly relevant to us individuals' life, and warn against the politicalization of science before communication or challenge politicalization after it occurs. So then going on here to talk about the implications for us, and when I was speaking to the NOAA board, I was particularly asked to talk about it from the viewpoint of the academic sector, but of course this works across all sectors. But some of the concerns are things that, of course, it really impacts university research missions, especially research on sensitive issues like climate change, but many, many others, including, I think, international and area studies. The chilling effect it can have on classrooms, making it more important for us to feel, students to feel comfortable with debate and discourse on controversial issues. And as Sarah already mentioned, the really negative impact this can have on student recruitment and the experiences of students at U.S. universities, especially those of international students on here. And again, to think about what we could possibly do in here, again, we can reaffirm our core values, continue to teach for a better world, continue to produce significant research no matter what the sensitivity of the topic, and become better science communicators. I think we can all do that, hard as though that can be, and need to study and better understand then the rise in science politicalization so that we know how to more effectively combat it. And we need to teach others, including our students, to really evaluate their sources that they get information from. And I think we need to take the high road, but at the same time, handle debate professionally, okay? Monitor our own stridency. And also to exercise our rights as citizens, which is one of the reasons I'm very excited about the March for Science on that. It's a way that we can then be citizens. And moving on here. So here's the slide that I gave to the NOAA board. And so we were talking, it was just, recently after the election. So here's the things that I thought naively at the time. That, first of all, environmental regulation and concern about the environment was bipartisan, okay, on that. And I particularly mentioned that the EPA had a very long history of bipartisan support. So we'll see how this plays out, okay? The other thing at that time that was in the news was the DOE labs. And again, I argued that they were highly regarded and they would be difficult then to support commercializations of the lab. I then went on to say that I thought there would be a lot of international pressure making it difficult for the U.S. to withdraw from all climate change agreements and commitments. And again, this is certainly not as optimistic as I was then. And pointing out too that there's still going to be work towards alternative fuels. At the time I initially did this, Bill Gates had just issued his billion-dollar breakthrough energy ventures there. But the last 3 points, I think, are still reasons for optimism. And that is that many of the environmental efforts, especially regarding climate change adaptation, have shifted then to the local and to the regional, to cities, for example, that are making attempts to adapt to climate change. And of course, then our young people, they care about the environment, they care about the economy, they care about civil rights, they care about education and job opportunities. And again, I am optimistic that, especially with this push now, that we'll all become better science communicators. And so I'm going to show one last slide here, and this is from then the Yale Program for Science Change Communication. I think it's actually another slide of optimism. We were told not too long ago that carbon dioxide does not affect climate change. Yet here we see that over half, in some places, 60 to 70% of the population across the country then support regulating CO2 on that. So again, optimism that we can move forward here on sensitive issues like climate change.
Hello, everybody. My name's Vicki Lawson at the University of Washington, and I work on poverty and inequality. And so I was asked to say a few words about how we might think about poverty and inequality under the Trump administration. And I think I might be about to strike a bit of a different tone, drawing on theory from geographers to try to interpret the current moment, and then to use that to think about how we need to think about where we go. So this may be, grist for discussion afterwards. So I'll start by saying that homelessness and poverty in the United States are intensifying, as is $2 a day poverty. That has increased 196% since TANF was inaugurated in 1996. That said, poverty in the US has not been and continues to not be on the political agenda, except in the way in our popular culture of representing the poor as exceptional subjects that renormalize middle-class white normativity. This, I would argue, has enormous potential, negative potential, for thinking about how we as a society organize a politics against poverty. So for a brief analysis of how I read Trump's political discourse, it is one that divides working people along the lines of race, religion, and place. It is a politics of division. It's achieved through discourses that divide white people, often working class, often rural, against African American urban communities, from Native Americans, and from immigrants, especially immigrants from Latin America and Muslim-majority countries. During the campaign and up until now, Trump and his surrogates mobilize a discourse in which immigrants and people of color are often framed as responsible for the impoverishment of working white people by stealing their jobs, by overwhelming the welfare system, and stifling prosperity, hence the need for a wall or a Muslim ban, on and on. Trump's promise to build the wall, his refugee and immigration, his attempts at a refugee and immigration ban, and his remarks about a, quote, military operation for deportation, construct common ground between white working people and wealthy elites through appeals to safety, national security, white identity, and economic narratives of fairness. This narrative, as a political narrative, obscures how poverty is intimately connected with extreme wealth accumulation achieved through the rolling back of financial sector regulations, environmental rollbacks that favor the business class, tax policies that favor the wealthiest Americans, and an ongoing defunding of the social safety net. So this doubling down on a narrative of fear and division, a politics that endorses state-sponsored violence against Latinos and Muslims, makes working class solidarities or anti-poverty solidarities literally unthinkable and has deep implications for how we do an anti-poverty politics. I want to draw on Marcuse, Doreen Massey, Stuart Hall, Lisa Marie Cacho to say a few words about how I think the Trump government, of course this is all speculative, I should have said that at the beginning, how the Trump administration and the Congress are going to govern poverty in the coming years. I would argue that there are three pieces to the governance of poverty, and this draws strongly on Marcuse's 1988 essay about neutralizing homelessness, but that continues today with a distinct edge around a politics of race. The first way that we as a society don't see poverty as a structural collective social issue is through denying poverty and homelessness. For example, framing poverty as a result of individual bad luck or bad choices, doubling down on workfare, the logic that argues people must be incentivized to work, continues to obscure the structural roots of poverty. The denial also occurs by thinking of poverty as exceptional rather than widespread, even though extreme poverty is on the rise. And the deniability of poverty is also reinforced by the possibility, the real risk, of a defunding of social science research that gathers evidence on race and inequality, the debates about the American Community Survey being one good example. A second politics that keeps us away from an alliance around anti-poverty politics is a specialization, a governance of specializing. So we focus on subpopulations, perhaps children, perhaps veterans, but we avoid confronting the systemic causes of poverty. So with Ben Carson installed at HUD, we see the potential for a doubling down on block grants, where states have discretion to actually spend social welfare money on other things if they can reduce the rolls. States can take radically different approaches to funding the social safety net, as we saw under the ACA with the Medicaid expansion. Trump's initial budget, granted it's a gesture, it's a political gesture, excuse me, cuts assistance for food aid, cuts Medicaid, cuts HUD and affordable housing, and eliminates the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Despite the congressional failure of the rollback of the ACA, at least this time, I think, which I would like to remind us all is a major anti-poverty program, I think we must be extremely vigilant about protecting Medicaid, which is an enormously important anti-poverty strategy. A third politics of obscuring poverty is that of isolating the poor, criminalizing people, banishing them from certain neighborhoods. Trump has doubled down on a law and order stand, and the federal stance on the militarization of deportation is political cover for aggressive policing, city ordinances against people living outside, the expansion of fees for contract for incarcerated people, imprisonment for not paying fees, and so on. And I could go on, but I won't. I'll spend a few minutes talking about what I think the challenges are for geography. As you analyze this agenda, which is a politics of race and poverty together, it suggests something that Ananya Roy has suggested and that I have taken up very seriously in my own thinking, which is that as a discipline, we must divest from whiteness and understand the centrality of race to the kinds of issues that I work on. To fully grapple with questions of poverty, we have to understand that poverty is not an economic question, but it is intersectional and race is at its core. People of color are at most risk of deeper impoverishment and violence. We need to think about ideas that have not been part of our normative discourse about poverty. We need exciting new engagements with Black Marxist thought and with post-colonial feminism. Another set of divestments that we might take in geography involve asking ourselves, and here again I draw on Ananya Roy, what will our role be, especially the most secure and privileged amongst us, like myself? What moral ground are we going to inhabit in the face of this assertion of attacks on people of color and the poor? As teachers and community members, what are we going to teach about? Hopefully not about poverty, actually, but about poverty governance, or about the history of taxation and its role in deepening inequality. We need to rethink taxation as an investment in society's future, not as toxic. Quoting Ananya one more time before I stop, she asks us, what stand will academics take when federal funding for research on poverty, inequality, and race is threatened? How much risk are we going to assume? And I would add to that, what new political imaginations will we fire? What politics of distribution and repair will we fight for? Who are we going to stand in solidarity with? Thank you.
Okay, I'm a nuts and bolts sort of person and numbers sort of a person. And so I want to just give you some nuts and bolts, some numbers, talk about some people, about where we are, what we're facing. I then want to talk about a little bit about who's to blame, and then I want to talk about what we might do about it. So let me give you some numbers. The budget, President's proposed budget, has come down with a Republican Congress and a Republican House and Senate. We could expect that the final budget may well look quite a bit like what has come down. And we're looking at cuts, for instance, to NASA of about, which is an executive program run through the executive branch, of $102 million. NOAA will have a cut of about 17%. That's about $900 million. The NIH will have a cut of 18%. That's about $5.8 billion. Department of Agriculture will have a cut of about 20%. That's the U.S. Forest Service, by the way, folks. And that will be about $5 billion. The EPA will take a cut of about 31%. That's $2.6 billion, 31% of its operating budget. These are massive, unprecedented cuts. Interior, which is the National Park Service, has gotten off relatively lightly with about a 12% cut, about $1.5 billion. And even that, though, we'll cut, and we'll cut deeply. What does that mean? What are some of the programs that have been essentially redlined here? 4 NASA satellites with specific duties to look primarily at climate change, aerosols, carbon, or solar variability, gone, cut. We are basically blinding ourselves at this point. The Clean Power Plan, in terms of decreasing carbon emissions here, cut. The American Waters Act, gone. The Agriculture, Water, and Wastewater Program, gone. The Great Lakes Cleanup Program, gone. The Sea Grant Program, which serves both coasts very well indeed, gone. The Global Climate Initiative and the Global Climate Fund. This is where we're trying to transfer some money from our country and wealthy nations to the poorer nations so that they can deal with climate change adaptation, $4 billion or so. This was really setting a program that the developing world, the global south, was looking at as justice, as social and environmental justice. Gone. 29 national estuary research areas on both coasts, gone. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, let's think about people then, because that's the proposed budget. What about the people who are going to stand up and fight for us? In Interior, we have Ryan Zinke. I must say that we kind of dodged the bullet because Sarah Palin was being proposed for that position. The one thing about Ryan Zinke is he believes in the USGS and its research mission, and that and Landsat 9 has been somewhat protected. He also is a public lands advocate. There are people in the Republican Party who would like to see us divest ourselves of all of our public lands, full stop. There are other issues with Ryan Zinke, lead bullets on lands and drilling and oil. Okay, but it could have been way worse. But let's take a look at, if you want to look at way worse, take a look at the EPA. Scott Pruitt, who is now the administrator of the EPA, is famous for lawsuits against the EPA, not just on climate denial, but on a number of things. But you know, he's the guy on top. What about the people that are working under him? Folks, that's a really interesting thing to look at. For his deputy administrator and the staff who've been brought in to actually run the things, we have Ryan Jackson, Brian Brown, Andre Wheeler. All of those people were former staff members with Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma. If you think you're going to get any traction or action on climate change, you can forget it. Who is then been appointed as the advisor on climate change and air quality to the administrator of the EPA? It is Mandy Gunasekara. She graduated from law school in 2010, was a lobbyist for the chemical industry, and then went to work with which Senate office do you think? Senator Inhofe. Do you recall the snowball incident when do you know who handed him that snowball? That is the new special advisor on climate and air quality to the EPA. So folks, I'm not counting on much coming out of the EPA. Those are the people. Some of the programs may be a little bit protected in places like Interior. I'm very worried about EPA. I could go on and on and on with this, but who's to blame? Who's to blame for this? Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump won the Electoral College. Donald Trump made it very clear as to what he was going to do, and he's doing just what he said. There was not really bait and switch here. He was elected, and he's doing what he said during the campaign. Who is to blame for this? Me and you. How are we to blame? We obviously did not communicate what we care about in terms of environment and climate change, in terms of education, in terms of politics and our role in the world, in terms of the importance of science and fact-based decision-making, in terms of the importance of poverty, environmental justice, social justice, and racial equality. We did not communicate that passion and the importance of these issues to enough people to keep someone who manifest and put these proposals, immigration, on race, on the environment, right out there. We did not communicate enough our abhorrence of that and the reasons why these are bad policies in order to win that election. Now, what are we going to do about it? The clock is running. We have 2 years, less than 2 years now, to the next congressional elections. we have to be better communicators. Does that mean we have to be better on YouTube? We have to learn to stand up in front of a group of people. We have to write more op-eds, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, it does. But you know what? That's not all of it. Where have we failed? I think we failed as being listeners. I think that's part of it. I had a young student write to me this last year, said, you know, I'm a Republican and I was for Trump. And he said, you know, I enjoyed your class because you allowed everyone to express their views. In most classes, I feel I get belittled by the other students. I'm afraid to talk about how I feel. I'm afraid to talk about what I'm concerned about. I don't think we're listening well enough. I think that there is a number of people in the election who are being driven by fear, who are being driven by feeling disassociated. And I think that this does cross actually racial lines to a certain extent. But of course, it's really concentrated in the white, uneducated males and things like that. They're fearful. They're seeing their life expectancy decreasing. And folks, they feel that we're not listening. Okay? So I think we do have to communicate, but I think we've actually got to get out there and listen. We have to listen, and we have to one-on-one and in a persuasive manner and in a compelling and honest manner tell people what we feel, what we know, what we understand as geographers and as human beings. The clock is running out, and it really scares the living hell out of me. Thank you.
You know, probably one of the more frightening things about doing a panel, particularly when you do one that's been put together really at the last minute, and really thank Glen MacDonald for doing this, is that we haven't had really a lot of time to compare notes. And I just found out that he stole my thunder, but that's fine, because what I would like to do is actually build directly onto some of his points, but it's very good points made. I do want to thank you for coming to Boston and being here tonight. I also want to recognize a group of people who are not here, who are not sitting in these seats, and maybe they would sit in the seats that are now empty here in the room. I want to recognize those who were not able to join us at the meeting. Those were the victims of recent travel restrictions. Those were the, in fact, victims of immigration enforcement. I also want to recognize those who perhaps do not feel welcome or safe to be in the United States right now, which we know, in fact, is true. I also want to recognize those who perhaps did not come in solidarity with protesting the current administration. So let's not lose sight of the fact that even though we've had a stellar record-breaking meeting, it's a wonderful meeting. It's so wonderful I'm about to collapse up here. But we, in fact, have many people who are not here. And we don't have an exact number, but we know that some people are not here. I would like to not take too long with my remarks, because I know there's a desire to have the audience involved, and I really would like to have you guys involved as much as possible. And I know there's also already been said some very wonderful things and some wonderful insights. And to just really build upon what Glen has mentioned, I think one of the greatest things, and Glen asked me to reflect, because there's plenty I would like to say about things within my own realm of the study of race and African American communities and civil rights, and that in itself would take a whole panel. Glen's asked me to sort of reflect on perhaps where AAG, and I know Doug will come up and tell us some even more important things, but I want to reflect a little bit on where AAG may go in the next year during my presidency, but also thinking even longer term than that. I think one of the greatest things that AAG can do, and all of its members can do, is to really engage in what Glen is talking about, which is sort of realizing this power of listening, and also this power of listening and sharing with each other. And when I say the power to listen, and this is where I'll add on just a little bit to my colleague, I don't see that as a passive, non-political practice. I see listening, if you draw from some of the theory that I read, as embodied within the politics of voice. It's about ensuring a great range of voices participate in governance and decision-making. It's about recognizing also that not all people's voices are allowed to be heard equally. And we'd be very sensitive to that as we engage in this listening that we've been encouraged to do. I see listening as an active process of paying attention to the needs and struggles of our members, as well as all those in our communities where we live. And I see listening as a foundational step in a plan of action. So listening is not separate from action. It's in fact an important part of it. And in fact, I would suggest that listening is part of the production of understanding and also the production of empathy. And the Lord knows, just to be Southern about it, the Lord knows that we could use a bit more empathy in this world right now. And even when we don't agree with each other, I think your point was great, Glenn, about having a student who perhaps doesn't feel like their views are reflected in the larger class. Even when we encounter people we don't agree with, we need to be doing a fair bit of listening. I can tell you that the AAG Council, which I'm very honored to be part of, makes better decisions when it has the benefit of hearing from the wider geography community. We've been doing a great deal of listening over the past several months, using the comments, the questions, the frustrations, the petitions of members to guide how we respond to policy and to the civic challenges from the Trump campaign and the Trump election. And for the first time in recent memory, and I think some of you were there in attendance, I appreciate that, we held a town hall right after the AAG Council meeting. And that's where members could pose questions and concerns. I can envision in the future, I would love for us to have one to continue that tradition next year and the years later, to have even more opportunities to listen to the shared perspectives. I know there's a lot of sessions, I know there's a lot to be said, there's a lot to be heard, but honestly, these are issues that we've got to come together and listen and share about. I encourage all of you to reach out and share with the AAG and share with each other the stories and struggles of your communities, your universities, your schools, your workplaces. Now, we do face a difficulty here. You know, we have a lot of communication channels and devices, and it seems like there's no shortage of that. Even in the AAG, we have tremendous communication capacity. But take, for example, knowledge communities. You know, these, I know it's an out-of-date term, these listservs that in effect people post announcements and so forth on. We've got to get a better handle on how we use those. And are they just simply a way of announcing sessions, or are they truly arenas for us to talk and debate? And every time we do have people who want to debate, they get told on the knowledge community, that's not the place for this. Well, where the hell is the place for this, right? So we've got to figure some of this out. I probably shouldn't have used profanity, but it's too late now. It's especially important that our local, state, and nationally elected officials are made to listen, that they in fact listen, not just us, and they acknowledge our concerns, particularly our concerns about anti-progressive policies and how those policies are impacting our communities of learning, our industry workplaces, and our international collaborations. And I would suggest to sort of bring this to a point in terms of listening, that by listening and be willing to share and act upon what we hear, we can work to mobilize our stories. Because I think of my own disciplinary background, I see a lot of power in stories. And if we bring together enough stories and we mobilize them in evocative and compelling ways about what people are facing and about, in fact, what is the reality of these cuts that have been described and the poverty and inequality that's been exerting its burden on us, then in fact we can perhaps counter the very oppressive narratives that come out of the current presidential regime. And I will tell you from my own experience that I've been horrified by the racist storytelling that goes on and out through the alt-right during the election and beyond. These counter stories that we put together, they can be powerful. This listening, this sharing, this building, this broadcasting of stories is not just cathartic, it's not just therapeutic. I mean, it truly can move us emotionally, it can move us politically, it can move us scientifically. To again bring this to an end, I think one of the other things that we need to realize is that to accompany this power of listening also requires that we realize the power of doing and the power of acting. And one of the things I'm really pleased about is that the AAG is really all over the policy scene. And in fact, we need to move forward by continuing to have policy intervention. We do need to build collaboration and solidarity with other organizations. But even more importantly, got the 2-minute warning, even more importantly, we really need to materially engage with the public. We need to leverage our research, our teaching, our outreach, our public pedagogy to make a difference and to show, in fact, why geography matters, but why geography can, in fact, matter in today's turbulent times. I will suggest to you, we, in fact, one of the first days of the conference held a panel on this very stage. I don't think everybody was as smart as this group. This is a very prestigious group. It's a very tough crowd out here. But we did assemble a panel on public intellectualism. And what we really learned was we have a lot of members who are, in fact, very experienced in engaging the public in this very process of communication and advocacy and working with communities. But at the same time, we have a fair number of members who have never been trained in that, who have never taken a course. I never took a course, right? And so we've got to find moments and spaces and times in which we can come to with members and we can, in fact, create a public geography. More concretely, we can create public geographers. And I would suggest, in closing, that in New Orleans, one of my big goals, one of my big themes, is that we really get down to brass tacks, not to somehow get away from the importance of intellect and theory and theorizing what we're doing. But we need to actually get into the brass tacks of teaching people how to write op-eds, how to write to their elected officials, how to teach controversial topics in classes. We need to talk about how does one connect with and partner with community groups. It's a long-term social relationship, not just a very quick thing that one does. These are things that, in fact, we need to be in the business of doing in addition to all the wonderful things that we do in terms of presenting papers and having lively, heavy intellectual discussions. These are not separate. The politics of listening and acting and doing and the politics of our scholarship are one and the same. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. My voice is getting a little strained at this time of the meeting. I apologize. But, in fact, could I grab that couple glasses? I would like to, I've been asked to be the discussant on the panel. And, you know, I think that we've heard multiple dimensions of really good advice and insight and description of what we're up against and so forth. I want to take the listening topic just one step further. We have to listen also to people who are not like us. That's part of the reason why this election went where it went. But we also, in terms of communicating, we have to do that as well. And it is often a process of neighbor to neighbor, in community action and so forth. There are now communities mobilizing across the United States to do precisely that, to get together with their neighbors. My daughters, one in Baltimore, one in Connecticut, are both involved in those kinds of projects. And I think that's that level where they reach out to people who are not like them and begin to describe the impacts that are occurring in making a change at the local level. I think that one of the distinctions are, you know, I'm struggling right now with the distinction between making statements and making change. There's been an awful lot of emphasis, as there typically is in academic associations, on making statements, making those statements as strong as possible, as vociferous as possible, as condemning as possible. And we can do that. I mean, that's easy. I've written through a few of those already. And I think that's fine. That vents anger. It makes us, you know, puts us on the map. We're also trying to figure out how we're going to make change. And one of the ways we're going to make change, I just mentioned, organize locally with your neighbors and others. The other way that we can make change over the next 4 years, and I think we're looking at 4 years, it's we certainly want to engage in the next election. But the fact of the matter is that almost all of the Senate seats that are open are Democratic seats. So it's going to be hard to get 3 other senators elected from across the aisle. With the gerrymandering that's occurred and with the number of Republican governors now in position, the gerrymandering is going to get even worse. That makes it difficult to win back those 22 House seats that are out there. So we're looking at 4 years, most likely, aside from an impeachment, which would just put somebody else, maybe more effective, in office. You know, the strategy that we have at the AG is to monitor what goes on. We're one of the few associations with a full-time public policy office, and I just hired another person to work half-time with John Whitman, who does a very able job of representing. So he's a terrific knowledge of the Hill. I was a registered lobbyist for about 8 years once myself, but all those people I knew are now somewhere else. But in the case of the AG, we monitor these events very carefully, and we craft responses to them. We've crafted a strong letter on the budget. We've done very strong letters on the travel ban, of course, and on many other areas, including, of course, the one of them on Senate Bill 103 and House Bill 482, which would prohibit the use of geospatial data for analyses of racial disparities, if you can believe it. So we were the AG was the first one onto this. I got a call from Nancy Krieger of Harvard, who had just shared a plenary session with at NIH the week before, and she says, "Doug, here's some stuff about geography. What's going on?" And so we were the first to write to Senator Lee and Congressman Gosar about this, put them on notice that this was a serious issue. Then when we developed a sign-on letter, which we sent out to a lot of groups, and on that sign-on letter we got signed on to it already in opposition to those kinds of bills. NAACP, American Geosciences Institute, Anthropology Group, the Consortium for Social Sciences, but also we have the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. We have the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association. We've got the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. And we've got the Poverty and Race Research Action Committee in a list of about 30 or 40 others. That has put them back on their feet. And I guarantee that we're going to make a difference on this issue. This issue is not going to get through Congress with the coalition that we've now assembled, working with others. And so this is where we make a difference. But when we wrote our letters, we didn't tell them what blank, blank, blank idiots and so forth they were, and how absolutely outraged and that we demand something from them. No, we wrote a letter that was very clear, very firm, very strong in our opposition, but we also left the door open, and we also offered, as we all frequently do, to use our own discipline's own tools to, if they would like, we'd be happy to use our geographic expertise to identify the number of people who would be negatively affected in amongst their constituents, and to make a map for them, which we could also help distribute through their district. So these are the kinds of things you have to do. We have to be clear, we have to be strong in our views, but our actions, if we want to actually try to beat back some of these proposals. You know, if we don't care about it, if we just care about, you know, having the right position, making lots of statements, etc., we're not going to get very far. But so we do have to have that ability to contact Congress, and we're doing that on all these budget issues. And you know, I want to make it clear, this is a very long, protracted process. The kinds of outrages that we've seen already have just begun. I think that among the next set of targets will be higher education in general. So this is a serious, serious problem. It's one that cannot be solved by rhetoric alone. And of course, words mean, we all know that words mean something. They're very important, and especially in our field. But words alone will not make change. So one of the things that we've repeatedly appended to many of our legislative activities in the past is a note to our members and all of our members and to all of you who care about this, that on these issues, we will monitor them, we'll provide you all the information that you need, we'll identify what the impacts are of these proposed legislation that we're going to see over and over again. But we need you to go to your own congressman in your own district, and we need to have you contact them. And everybody says, and you know, I've heard it from people who call us, why aren't you doing more, you know? And yet I said, well, did you contacted your congressperson? No, I haven't. They won't listen to me. You know, they're in a different party. You know, I said, well, you know, if we want to make something happen here, people are going to have to do that, and it's something that you can best do by contacting them locally in their district offices. But otherwise, John and I and others, we will always have available a list of your congressmen and senators in ways in which you can contact them directly, either by email or by paper letter. So this is necessary. It's really necessary. I think this meeting is part of the process. This meeting, we had Rush Holt here, AAAS, talking to us about how they make change and where he says he's a former congressman, also interestingly a Jeopardy champion. He's become a good friend, and we were able to move him up here for a very important talk, which went really well. Of course, we got Noam Chomsky here. We've got David Harvey. We've got James Hansen. We've got one of our main themes on mainstreaming human rights in geography in the AAG, with 250 speakers, by the way, from many of them major leaders of international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and many more. Those sessions have provoked a great deal of really insightful talk. So I think with this meeting, we're launching, in other sessions such as this one for itself and many others on communications and on the impacts of the election that we've organized. So I think that with 9,400 people here at this meeting, we've got a lot of people to talk to get organized with your groups of friends and people that you don't normally interact with. What we really have to do is get serious about either making change by blocking some of these proposals, which we can do, and you know how we can do it? If we get 3 senators with some kind of conscience somewhere in the back of wherever, we get 3 senators who are willing to come over on principle or on who knows what, maybe afraid they'll lose the next election. But we're working to get 3 senators to move across the aisle and vote against some of these programs. And we can do it. I think we can do it because some of them are so bad that, you know, people are not always going to vote for just along party lines. Or we can bring 22 representatives across and vote against some of these programs. So to do that, we need your help. We'll be there talking to their staff, talking to them, writing letters, you know, that are clear in our opposition, but not inflammatory. You know, we can't, you know, we got pressure earlier, oh, you know, your language is not strong enough. Well, you know, it's very clear, however, in the opposition. But I do think that all of the other suggestions here are important. We laid out the problem. It's enormous. To do something about it, we all need to work together, and we will take the lead at the AG, just as we have been doing so far. This group of people, especially our current council, and Derek and Glenn, many others on our executive committee, you know, we've literally been working around the clock, around the weekends, to get these kinds of messages out, to get our analysis down, to contact people on the Hill. It's been a very, very strong thing. So we do have a 501c3 status, but within that we have certain options to lobby. And you'll notice, however, that so as not to use up the allocation of lobbying that we can do, when we ask you to contact your congressperson, we're not going to say and to vote for this or and to oppose this bill. We'll lay it all out for you, and then at the end we'll ask you to contact your congressperson and give them your views on this action. That takes us off the hook for lobbying. So anyway, we're totally committed, and we've got a good team, and we've got great support, inspiration, and guidance. So that's what I would like to do. I'd like to think about I think we should make statements, but I want us to think about the distinction between, or let's say, the complementary aspects of statements and making change. Thank you.
Okay, so I thank the panel for that. So I'd like to take questions, start the discussion. I'm going to ask you two things. When you stand up, tell us who you are and where you're from. And secondly, please keep your questions or comments short so that we can have plenty of time for everybody to get them in. So you had your hand up, sir.
Hi, my name is Barney York from the University of Kansas. I appreciate Derek and Doug's event that we have together. And I appreciate the emphasis on listening and communication that many of you have spoken to, but I fear that it also does not address some very important deeper dynamics that structure the consciousness of the American public and lead many people to vote the way that they did. And in particular, I think we need to encourage our students to become more critical about how they consume information. We have a country in which a quarter of the public believes the sun goes around the earth, in which 77% of people believe in angels, right? In which the public knows a lot about batting averages and what the Kardashians are doing, but they can't find Iraq or Afghanistan. And it seems to me incumbent on us to get students to appreciate how this information is produced and why there is a systematic bias in the information to which they are exposed. In particular, things like Rupert Murdoch and the News Corporation, which owns the Washington Post and Fox News. For example, we can encourage students to recognize false equivalencies, this idea that there's a debate among climate scientists and that the science is unresolved, which is simply not true. And without sort of encouraging students to engage in that sort of criticality, I think all the listening and communication actually will kind of fall on deaf ears. Right? I hate to be so pessimistic and cynical in my reading of this, but I think we have to engage with a public that is fundamentally ignorant and anti-intellectual in a way that the people in this room are not. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a comment. I just don't think that the starting position should be we have to engage with a public that is ignorant and anti-intellectual. I honestly to God think that's part of the problem we're facing right now and why we lost this election. I'm sorry about that, Barney, but I just feel that we just can't start with that basis, okay? But I asked the panel to comment.
Go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I mean, I think this is a vital thing for us to be talking about. And I'm heading up an undergraduate program at the University of Washington right now, and we survey the freshmen that are direct admitted into the UW Honors Program and ask them what keeps them up at night. And interestingly, this year, I mean, it was about the time of the election, so uninteresting in a sense, they said political polarization and fake news. They wanted to understand more about these issues. So I think that there's an awareness on the part of many that we are in some ways being entrapped in these dynamics and aren't really clear about how to think them through. So whether people are educated or not, I think the sort of the social media bubble problem and the fact that whether we intend to or not, we're often in echo chambers without being really reflective about it, is something that actually transcends both sort of more or less educated lines, that it's actually a real thing. And so just to say that there is an issue here, yeah.
Well, I don't know if this will answer you. It's a very, very good.
Repeat the question because people in the back couldn't hear.
Good idea.
Okay, so how colleagues in more liberal areas can assist those colleagues living in, I assume what you're referring to as conservative areas? Yeah, okay. You know, I think some of this is just, to get back to a point I made, is understanding the mechanics of how we carry out that public engagement. So now we've heard from at least, I think, 2 or 3 people, including myself, about outreach and writing one's elected officials. But honestly, even though I've done it a couple times, I don't know how well I've done it. So I think one of the ways that we help colleagues, because in the environments where I've worked, which I've worked in the conservative South, I have not had mentors who have necessarily coached me up on how to write my elected official or how to write op-eds. I've never seen many colleagues engage in the writing of op-eds. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're all, completely oppressed down south, but what I am getting at is that we've got to see examples. We've got to have actually, I think, some instruction. I would love to see from John, what does a good letter to an elected official look like? Not, of course, asking the AAG to give me the letter of what I should write. You see what I'm getting at? And that's just I know that doesn't address completely what you're saying, but for those colleagues like me who are not in a culture that encourages that, we have to have some examples and some training, I think.
I wanted to address that a little bit too. I'm in a Congress district that's very conservative, but some friends of mine started a group. We actually call it Epic Women of Lansing, and we meet once a month, and there's a very active Facebook page, members-only Facebook page on this, where we're quite aware of each of the bills that might be of interest to us are coming up for vote, and example letters are shared. And also it's just an encouragement to each of us to call, and I've called more than I ever have to this representative, just because of this encouragement that I'm getting from these epic women. So.
Hi, I'm John Hayes. I'm from San State, a geographer. In terms of Barney's question, just have just a concrete suggestion. You might do it already for the last Barney, but I teach a global climate change class, and after we cover the science of climate change and mitigation of gas emissions and all that, about 3 weeks ago, I showed the film Merchants of Doubt in the class with the study guide, and since they've learned about climate change, and then they see this how people make money from misinformed, that's industry. It opened their eyes, or it just absolutely opened the students' eyes. They aren't aware of it, and just a concrete suggestion, Merchants of Doubt, show it in the classes.
I do want to say one thing. I let my Scots temper get up a little bit about Barney's comment about the... I think rather than thinking of people as being ignorant, I think we should think about them as being misinformed. I mean, and they're being systematically misinformed. A lot of times these are smart people, but they think that's reality what they're hearing out there, whether it's on race relations, the threat by migrant communities, they're just misinformed. And I think we can take a real strong stand against that without being demeaning to the people that we're trying to talk to and communicate. That was what I meant, so I apologize for that. Please.
Hi, MacDonald from A&M University. I'd like to talk a little bit about public outreach. So, Dr. Alderman, you talked about working in New Orleans to arm participants with outreach skills and abilities. And Dr. Richardson, you talked about reaching out to Congress. What can be done at each annual meeting to reach out to the host city itself?
Mm-hmm.
What can be done to inform the host city of its presence, of our presence, and of geography's presence, and offer our abilities and knowledge to these communities? Thank you.
No, that's a great question. In fact, one of the things I have planned is to, and I was going to work with Doug, so I don't want to blindside him in any way. But I would like to, in fact, bring more of the voices from New Orleans into the meeting itself, which has been done several times at different meetings, I think with great success, but it's been quite limited. I would in fact love to have a voice from the New Orleans area as part of my presidential plenary. And I'm working on that right now, not as we speak, but this week. I also think that I hear about other disciplines in their conferences where in fact they host service and outreach and engagement projects as part of the conference experience. You just have to be very careful because we're in the city for a very limited amount of time. We do not want to go in and be a bull in the china shop and cause more problems than we're actually helping, right? And, but there's no doubt that we've got to get beyond the walls of, and when I say beyond the walls, we have to allow folks into this building, and we have to get beyond this building to learn about what is in fact those communities are struggling with.
Two quick points. On the general issue, I grew up near Flint, Michigan, and there's a lot of class stuff going on, a lot of racial stuff, a lot of anti-Semitism now. There's just a lot of there are a lot of issues that when communicating, at least with people, you got to start with respectful, very respectful, presence. You just can't challenge them, tell them how little they know, even how misinformed they are, frankly. You have to just try to find a way, and one of the I think the most important tasks ahead politically are to let people know and show people how many of these programs that are being proposed are going to have negative impacts on their own lives. And that's something that you can, in a civil conversation, which is not we're up here and you're down here kind of conversation, you can get some of those points across. I mean, people growing up who I grew up with, they were all working class people, didn't have educations, but they were exceedingly astute politically, and they knew what was going on. Nobody could pull the wool over their eyes. And to this date, my parents are the same way. So it's not an issue necessarily of educational level. It's an issue of political cognizance and an understanding of what is going to happen to you with these programs. And secondly, very quickly, Drew, we talk about community outreach. We've done a tremendous job of that, I think, here, going into underprivileged communities and working very closely and intensely with young students. Drew, could you make a very, very brief summary?
Very, very brief. My name is Drew Lehman. I'm a geographer and environmental scientist. And months ago, I spoke with Doug. We gave him the privilege of putting together what we call the Emerging Workforce Scholars Program. We brought in 14 students, cooperation with the Boston Mayor's Office, with the Opportunity United, the Boston Private Industry Council, and the Secretary of Labor of the state of Massachusetts. And I'll tell you, as a geographer, and we go over the color of who knows, and we were rising college freshmen, summer recently graduated. But listening to this panel, I have never been so proud to be a geographer. And I thank you very much for standing up and being heard. Next year in New Orleans, that is the blackest city in the United States. We brought in over $15 million to this community this year. Think about that next year. Thank you for the opportunity.
In the back, please. I'll get to you folks.
From Western University. I wanted to echo or voice my appreciation for the conversation around race and what it has to do with our broader conversations about what it means to be a geographer, what it means to carry our discipline forward. But I'm troubled and I'm interested to hear from the panel about something that has been bothering me and bothered me when the announcement was coming out. And that's simply the fact that the racial representation on this panel is less racially diverse than the administration we've been talking about.
That's right. That's right.
And have lots of issues with. And I think that it's important to recognize that looking around the room, and particularly on this panel, we do not have representation in this discipline. And we're talking about having conversations around listening, being more inclusive, reaching out to broader communities and being representative of our discipline, I feel that this is a missed opportunity with the composition of the panel, and that's not to take away from anything that you all contributed wonderfully into the ideas and things like that. But I didn't know whether or not I was going to come to this session simply because I didn't know that this session was necessarily speaking for me or the people or the geographers of color that are in the room. And so I think that when we're organizing these sessions about who speaks for geography, who speaks for the discipline and beyond, we need to make sure that that the panel represents who we are trying to reach and where we are trying to go with this.
So I appreciate that. I take 100% responsibility for that. And I am actually not going to apologize. I wanted past presidents, and I wanted a range of different perspectives. And then I wanted to have a broad audience participation, so this was not us and them, this was all of us together. And you're here, and I'm very, very pleased with that, and I'm pleased with your comments. But I take full responsibility. I really wanted a broad range of ideas and perspectives from past presidents. And this was the group I chose. And I think, I know that Vicki and Derek work on issues of race and are very informed about that and would help us to understand that. And I think that as this organization develops, this room will change its complexion over time. I would hope 20 years from now it would change its complexion. But please don't blame my fellow panelists or the AAG. If you have a bone to pick, it's okay, it's with me. And I was really looking for ideas, and I wanted to get past presidents here who've all been in the hot seat and kind of dealt with these kind of issues.
Could I
and
just say something?
Speaking of people of color, Audrey Kobayashi is a good friend of mine. She's a past president, but she lives in Canada, for example. And when I was looking at just the different things represented here, I was thinking about ideas. So that's where it is. I take full responsibility. I know that in terms of our makeup, we do not represent the broad diversity of this country or the broad diversity of even our organization, which is actually pretty white compared to most of the country, but we're working on it. But I was hoping to have ideas, and I was hoping that we would have a diversity here for this conversation. So I thank you for that very much, and please, I take full responsibility. Okay,
Could I just?
Yeah.
I just also want to thank you for standing up and saying that. I appreciate you doing that, and you're right. And Glen's point is well taken, that we represent the past of this institution, and there is a structural reason that we're all white, which has to do with the past of this discipline. And all I can say is the critique is appreciated, and the discipline needs to change, and that's part of what Ananya Roy is asking us to do, is divest from whiteness in every sense. And thank you for inviting us to think very deeply about that.
There's someone in the back, way in the back there. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Alderman. I'm from AAG University in Australia. I can understand because a few people have said they can't, so that's scary. I basically just wanted to say that I think that one of the really important things that academics need to do, and most of you are academics, is to join in partnership with people who are practitioners. I am
comment?
Great comment.
Thank you for that. Yeah. You have, you and then him, how about that?
I'm Aaron Grove. I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and a comment suggestion with the Graduate Association of Geography and Environment at UT. We formed a committee on gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, I think, is a significant issue in terms of GIS representation of what our communities. And gerrymandering is also a great threat to our republic. As in 2015, Jimmy Carter said we're living in an oligarchy. There's a study from Princeton that says we're living in an oligarchy. There are only 13 states that have nonpartisan commissions for the drawing of congressional districts. So we need to think about disenfranchisement. The city of Austin is effectively disenfranchised. One district cuts all the way from West Austin to Fort Worth, another cuts from East Austin down to San Antonio, effectively disenfranchising a million people within that greater metropolitan area, including the University of Texas at Austin. So I think geographers need to be at the forefront of that fight in terms of having a nonpartisan, every state having a nonpartisan commission for the creation of congressional districts both at a federal level and at a state level. Second, I would urge the AAG members to consider running for local office, be it on school boards, city council, or county board. I think that those are all valuable positions and oftentimes filled by ignoramuses and malevolent people.
Alec, you're a...
I mean, both of the last two comments I think were great, and just to give more time to the audience, I don't want to say too much, but I made the comment about the legitimacy of the polity in some senses gets brought into question when fundamental institutions no longer carry a sense of legitimacy themselves. And gerrymandering is exactly this kind of a problem, and it is a fundamentally geographic problem. So I think that's an area where we can and should be really out front.
Can I'd just like to add that one of my dear emeritus colleagues, Dick Morrill, at the University of Washington, was deeply involved in mapping congressional districts. And there's a tradition of that, and I think you're right. I think we should absolutely up the ante and make sure we do a great deal more of it.
Yeah, that's great. Using the tools of our discipline, it makes it even more powerful when we walk in to talk to somebody. And the other way is visualization, visualizing, the negative impacts of a particular piece of legislation or legislative proposal. I think, we've got departments everywhere with really good mapping capabilities, and to begin to show people maps of how they're going to be impacted on healthcare, or how they're going to be impacted in terms of their Social Security, or how they're going to be impacted environmentally, for that matter. So that's a really effective communications tool. It's an integral part of our discipline. So I urge everybody to think about how they can communicate in that way as well.
Now.
My name is Steve. I'm from UCLA, and my question follows up on John's comments and Steve's comments and Vicki's comments and Glenn's comments about racial issues in our system. So my question would be to the panel: what can? I think this forum has done a very solid job of putting women and international students to the discipline. But what can say faculty do to recruit minority students who grew up here in the U.S.?
So this is an institutional challenge at every one of our institutions. And at the University of Washington, which I know well, there's a lot of talk about diversity, which means sort of include more people, check boxes, but not a lot of serious engagement with how institutions themselves need to change in order to be places that recruit, retain, and support people of color, whatever, underrepresented folk, whatever we want to use as the term. And so I think that we need to go beyond a sort of add and stir, let's all get along kind of model, to get to a model where we say, what is it about our institution? let's say the University of Washington, that is fundamentally white and unwelcoming. And how do we need to transform that? So it isn't about add and stir, it's about a transformational inquiry. And it takes hard work, and it's really hard to do. And we all have to lean in on that kind of work as well.
Can I just a comment on that? So I did write one of the, I don't know whoever reads the president's columns, but I wrote one and I looked at the stats for our organization, which are not good, and talked about, looking at academia in general and looking at the demography. But it comes down to actually the department and the individual. It really does, and it comes down to the individuals going into the communities, maybe going to the community colleges, getting involved in the high schools. By the time you get here, it's too high up in some ways. We can do some really great things. I think that the program we had with the scholar workforce was fantastic. I went to the graduation and met all those students. It was fabulous. But we have to all be doing that in our departments and as individuals, because the discipline itself has a fairly low diversity relative to the diversity of the nation, or even to most of the academic institutions we're in. I think it's a problem we've got to confront. It's the future of the discipline, future of our nation.
And just a quick add-on, I mean, the part of the total rethinking that needs to go on includes what we teach and how we teach. And, we don't want to fall into the trap of simply saying underrepresented groups are only interested in underrepresented, issues. And that's a bad trap. At the same time, to teach a course about environment and urban and not talk about environmental justice, it represents a significant problem in the face of what we know is going on around us.
I will relay one example. So this past fall, I visited 2 historically black colleges, universities, because of my work with King, and I delivered two talks during the King holiday, and enjoyed those visits immensely, and realized that was very fertile ground for our discipline, is to be available to, in fact, go into those institutions that perhaps historically have not seen. Because if you look at some of the geography programs in those institutions, they're not always well developed, if existent at all. Maybe I wasn't the guy to go in there. I got an invitation, I was excited, I went. But the 2 things I heard from those 2 visits was, one, we didn't know that geography was so, really this much fun. So at least I got that right. And then second was, they didn't know that a white guy from the South cared about civil rights, which was disturbing, given sort of their expectations in 2017, and that convinced me that I and a lot of other people have not done a very good job of getting the word out.
So we have time for one more question. I have ignored this side of the room, so go ahead.
Talk about the community of concerned scientists. Just want to mention in connection with the question of moving into liberal areas and how we speak to people in conservative areas. The geography of this is that the conservative areas are not very far away.
That's right.
The blue cities are in the middle of a lot of
Yeah, you can see that easily anywhere.
That
places where there was, a landslide there. That means 60 or 70% of people voted for the system. It still leaves, 30 or 40% of the neighborhoods out there. I'd also mention that, a lot of those people agree with us on a lot of issues. That map up there is people demonstration of it. It's not necessarily true that people who voted for Trump disagree with you on every issue, nor that they buy the sorts of things you see in conservative media. So, I guess I would just use my own area as an example. I live in Maryland, in one of the bluest states in the nation, and actually one of the bluest counties in the nation. And yet, I'm in the rural part of it, pretty much the White House that my district goes to Trump. So I've got lots of neighbors.
So I think it's 7. And I think our time is up. So I thank you all very much, and I thank our panel. Let's give them a round of applause.